Ms. Graham, sorry.
Thank you, sorry. Can you do that? Maybe. I think that's the passage. Sorry, I'd like to move on at this moment to look at the minutes of the Gold Group meetings that we've looked at before. And I'd like to ask you some specific questions about matters arising from those minutes. Now, I'm not sure if you have a hard copy of those in your folder, but we do have the minutes on the screen.
Okay.
Are you comfortable using the screen for this purpose? Thank you. So if we could look at the first Gold Group meeting minute, agenda and minute, which is PS 06491. And this is it's 3 pages. See it on the screen. You'll see that that is from 11:30, the 3rd of May 2015, which we understand is the first Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
And that a number of people were present, including yourself. Your name's there. Now, in each of these meetings, the minutes where your name is mentioned are items 3 and 9 on each one. So let's look at item 3 first of all. And this is headed up investigative process, and your name is there alongside Pat Campbell's name.
Yes.
And so even though you were supporting him rather than taking the role of SIO, your name does appear first. Is there a reason for that?
Probably rank structure, probably.
Thank you. Was it, it says initial actions and investigation strategy outlined by Detective Superintendent Campbell in respect of the following areas. There's a number of bullet points given, and we've heard from Pat Campbell about these minutes. And is that your recollection that Pat Campbell spoke to this item on the agenda?
Yes, I had just shortly before arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Station, so, you know, my knowledge had been through the previous telephone calls only, and things had moved on from there, so I can't remember actually having much input at that meeting.
Thank you. I'm interested in one of the bullet points. You'll see number 9, I think it's CT considerations raised by ACC and to be reviewed by NIB.
Yes.
Do you remember any part of the discussion in relation to that bullet point? We've heard that CT is counter-terrorism.
Yes. I think, well, it was raised by ACC Nicholson, who was ACC Organised Crime Counter-Terrorism at the time, and it was for a check to be undertaken by the NIB just to exclude the possibility of this being terror-related.
Was there any reason given by ACC Nicholson at that meeting as to why he wanted the investigation to consider counter-terrorism?
I can't recall him going into any great detail, but at the time, the threat level was particularly high. I can say that ACC Nicholson was acutely aware of this, so every week we would have a detective chief superintendent meeting with the ACCs who had responsibility for crime and the DCC responsibility for crime. And every week Mr Nicholson would reinforce to us to remind our staff of the CT threat at the time.
Excuse me, Chair, there's a matter I require to discuss with Ms. Green very briefly. I don't think everyone has to rise. Excuse me.
activity to resolve an issue.
Thank you. Let me just ask you what I'm particularly interested in.
Okay.
And it's whether, as part of that discussion about counter-terrorism, there was any connection made between the fact that Mr. Boal was black and terrorism.
No.
Thank you. Can I ask you just very briefly to look at resources? As I understand it, there was nothing significant raised in relation to item 9 on the agenda, although your name was mentioned next to that. So if we can look at item 9, which is on page 3. And that relates to business continuity.
Yes.
And was there any significant aspects of the discussion about resources at that stage in the meeting?
I can't recall.
There's only one other thing I'm interested in asking you about here. It's under item 1 actually, and it relates to the terms of reference. Now you've been asked about this in your inquiry statement, and we see that the final italicised paragraph under item 1 is to ensure the integrity, interest and reputation of the police service of Scotland and its staff is maintained and safeguarded. And then underneath that in red it says, agreed that wording of terms of reference would be considered and amended for future meetings to provide terminology specific to circumstances of incident. Now, you've touched on this in your inquiry statement, that you had concerns in relation to the wording of aspects of the terms of reference. Could you just explain those in a little more detail to the Chair?
So this was one of my many pet hates. I don't know where this text originated from, the bit about ensuring the integrity, interest and reputation of Police Scotland. It must have circulated through Police Scotland somewhere. Maybe somebody had come up with it as a good suggestion, but on a couple of occasions, there's been one, and I think another 2 occasions, at Gold meetings, this would be included in it, and I disagreed with that reference because actually that can be interpreted that the reputation of Police Scotland comes before everything else, and how you undertake a objective, impartial investigation. So I cannot see why I wouldn't have raised it. I think I would have raised it because I have previously or afterwards. So, and then I see later on that it's removed later on. So there has to be a reason why it's removed. So although I cannot say for certain that I raised concerns about it, that was one of my pet hates, and it was removed. So my only assumption is I've said something, it's been reconsidered and it's been removed.
Were you concerned that if that remained, it would influence the investigation in some way?
It would influence everything, or it could influence. I mean, it's a wrong statement to make. You know, it's just wrong, and we've all heard in recent weeks about trying to protect reputations can lead to horrendous decision making. So it's just wrong.
All right, thank you. Can we move on to the second Gold Group meeting minutes? That's PS 07268. And again, this was the meeting at 1440 hours, it says. So this is after PERC have arrived. We've heard that they were present at this meeting, and you were also present, as we see from the top. If we can go straight to item 3, please. And that's on page 2. And again, item 3 is the investigative process. Your name and Pat Campbell's names appear there. I am interested in 2 of the bullet points here. The 4th bullet point reads, discussion PM post-mortem is likely to be carried out tomorrow afternoon. That was the 4th of May. That was the Monday, the next day. CSM, crime scene manager, to be deployed for each loci. Formal identification of deceased required. Can I ask you about the discussion regarding post-mortem is likely to be carried out tomorrow afternoon? Do you remember any part of that, the discussion about that matter?
I don't, sorry.
You don't. And then when we look at further down, the second last bullet point on the page, NOK strategy, next of kin strategy, partner of deceased made aware and statement noted. No formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Next of kin identified as sister and a flow being identified. 2 Police Scotland flows have been identified. 1 DI as flow to brief and coordinate. We've heard evidence about this. Do you remember this part of the discussion?
Vaguely.
Can I ask you to help us understand the distinction? It says here no formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Can you explain what a formal ID is?
So that would be, it could be by a number of ways in terms of DNA, fingerprints, dental records, something like that, or more commonly by next of kin.
And when you say more commonly, how is that identification facilitated?
Usually just prior to the post-mortem examination.
And how many family members would commonly be involved in that identification?
I can't say for certain. I think that would be up to the family, but maybe one. It's usually 2, actually. Yeah.
We've heard about the requirement in Scotland for corroboration.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be partly because 2 sources are required?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I can't remember.
All right. And how does
Actually, maybe just 1.
Oh, sorry.
1 in. No, sorry. I can't remember, to be honest.
No, that's absolutely fine. Compared to that sort of method of formal identification and a number of methods you've given, how would you describe an identification being done by, as exampled here, a Facebook image?
So I suppose it depends on who has provided the Facebook image. You know, are we certain that that image is the person that we're wanting? How clear is the image? How recent has the image been? So there's probably factors around that. And also in terms of facial injuries to Mr. Bayou. That could be a problem in terms of visual identification by somebody who doesn't know him, and that could perhaps cause problems. My understanding was the officer was very clear it was Mr. Bayou. And my understanding as well is there was other circumstantial information that also suggested it was Mr. Bayou.
Now, the chair may have evidence available in regard to an officer called Samantha Davidson who used images that were sent to her via WhatsApp, and that there's other written information available to the chair about an officer who had been in the house where Mr. Bayou had lived and had recognised an image on the fridge, I think, and had then worked out that was someone he recognised from his gym, I believe.
Oh, right, okay. So it's probably easier if it's somebody who knows or has had dealings with the individual before, as opposed to somebody who has no knowledge whatsoever in trying to identify somebody with potentially facial injuries from an old Facebook image. You know. Yeah.
And is it acceptable in terms of delivering a death message to a member of the family or a close contact with the deceased to use this less formal, informal method where perhaps there's a connection made?
I think it depends on, how certain the officer is in his or her identification. If they are very clear that it is the same person and there's other supporting information, yes, you would, because you're not going to get formal identification until a later point. So it's difficult to get to formal identification until you tell somebody that, there is a strong possibility that that person is who we think it is.
So in connection with communicating with the family, there would be that informal identification, first of all, then leading at a later stage to a more formal
Yes.
identification. Thank you. Thank you. Could we move on to the next minute, please, which is PS 03139. Again, if we can begin on item 3. These are the minutes for a Gold Group meeting that took place at 8:15 in the evening that day. You again were present at that meeting. And I'd like to look at item 3, investigative process. Again, your name appears there. And there was a discussion, an outline given by Pat Campbell at that time. Do you remember this meeting?
I'm sorry, I've got really little recollection of this meeting at all.
Right. Were you still it says you were present. Do you
Yeah.
remember that you were there?
I think it was reminded to me when I was giving my statement that I was there. I have little memory of this at all.
I'm interested in item 5 on this agenda. You'll see at the bottom it says family concerns, and I'll just read this out to you. It says Chief Superintendent McEwen discussed brother-in-law of deceased. He is part of an independent advisory group and had advised the initial attending officers that he knew Mr. McEwen and requested that he attend and speak with him within 24 hours. And we've heard from Gary McEwen that he had been to visit the family prior to this Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
And then it says Chief Super and Chief Inspector Shepherd attended at home address of next of kin, highly charged environment, deceased's partner Colette and extended family within, family concerned that early contact they had was purposely vague, they were unhappy they had not been told anything about who contacted the police and ambulance. Chief Superintendent provided them with an understanding of events. Chief Super discussed the role of the PERC and reassured them it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident. And it says task, there's no name given as to who was given the task. Family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. Do you remember anything about that part of the conversation?
Can I have a look at my initial statement?
Please do, yes.
It doesn't add anything to it. I remember that the update from Mr. McEwen around the family's upset concerns. In relation to the task, I don't have a recollection of that, sorry.
Thank you. We have heard evidence from the family that their concern at that time was that Mr. Boal's mother was in London and they wished her to come up to Scotland which, as I understand, the intention would be the next day, after the 3rd of May, the 4th of May, and that they wanted her to be present, and that would be done before the post-mortem was carried out. Do you have any recollection of that being discussed at the Gold Group meeting?
I'm not saying it wasn't, but I don't have a recollection of that.
Do you have any recollection of being advised or hearing a discussion that the family would not cooperate, would not attend the post-mortem to ID Mr. Boal?
No, I knew they were extremely upset with Police Scotland, but I can't recall anything to say that they would not identify Mr. Boal prior to post-mortem.
Thank you. And then can we turn on to the next page of the minutes? So this is page 3, and this is at towards the end of item 5 that we're discussing. And you'll see that the paragraph immediately above the task, Chief Superintendent discusses family desperate to know about post-mortem, and also arrangements on having them conveyed to mortuary in Edinburgh.
Yes.
Do you remember that part of the discussion?
No, but in terms of the arrangements for having a family conveyed to the mortuary, that would be a flow responsibility.
So we may have heard that it would normally be for the flows to help the family
Yes.
travel to the mortuary to do that. And it said the task to address all family issues raised. Do you remember having any involvement in that or any knowledge about how that would be addressed?
I don't, sorry. I can't recall that.
And then if we can look at the final page. Thank you. And you'll see in the middle of this, just above the middle of the screen, Chief Superintendent McEwen, not adverse. Do you see that paragraph?
Yes.
Not adverse to going back to house if required, to assist with retrieving items for the baby of Colette Bell, but telephone contact to be made by PERC regarding the family and arrangements, etc., for conveying to the mortuary. Do you remember any discussion about that?
I'm sorry, I don't.
And do you remember if PERC were part of a discussion about the family being conveyed to the mortuary?
I can't, to be honest.
Thank you. As I understand it, you did not attend subsequent Gold Group meetings on other days.
No, I didn't. That was my on-call duties finished.
So you were present in Kirkcaldy on the 3rd of May, but for the dates 4th and onwards, you were not present.
No.
Thank you. Can I ask you a point that I'd like to clarify? We talked yesterday about evidence that might assist the investigative team and the investigation. And I'm going to read out a paragraph from a written statement to the inquiry that the chair has available to him. And it's from a former police officer called PC Austin Bartlett. And we've heard evidence that former Officer Bartlett had been a serving officer, but on the day in question, on the 3rd of May, he'd also had a role as a Police Federation officer. And I'm going to read out a paragraph and ask about whether you think this would have amounted to something of evidential value to the investigation.
Okay.
So it's, for those sitting behind me, it's SBPI 00126 and it's paragraph 34. Sorry, I said Bartlett, didn't I? Austin Barrett, sorry, I apologise. Thank So this, I'm reading this from his inquiry statement. Alan and Craig came in. Now, we've heard evidence that Alan is PC Alan Payton, as he then was, and Craig is a serving officer, PC Craig Walker. And we've heard evidence they were the first two officers at the scene at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May. So Alan and Craig came in and said that they needed Federation help or advice. I jokingly said, this is Austin Barrett talking, I jokingly said I hadn't started work yet and I didn't start until 8 a.m. because I didn't think they were really wanting anything. I thought they were just having a laugh, and then they said that they needed advice because they had just killed someone. Craig said, and this is in quotation marks, "We've just killed someone." I'm pretty sure that's exactly what they said. Now, we've also heard evidence from both Payton and Walker in relation to this matter, and the chair has that evidence as well, and at least there's a denial about whether that was actually said or not. But looking at this statement from the officer, Austin Barrett, would this have been of some of the evidence or of evidential value to the investigation into the events surrounding Mr. Bayo's death?
Yes.
And how would that information have been shared with the investigative team?
In terms of a Federation rep,
He's a Federation rep on that day. He's a serving officer. He's present in Kirkcaldy Police Office. How would you have expected that information to be shared with the investigative team?
well, I suppose it's a police officer's responsibility to make sure that any information that may be relevant to an investigation is highlighted to the individual who is conducting that investigation. So
Sorry, I interrupted.
PC Barrett, is it?
Yes, PC Austin Barrett.
When it's something as significant as we've just killed somebody, I would have thought that he would have brought that to attention to somebody from the investigation team.
And you've used the word significant, and you previously talked about it being helpful to the team investigating the death. How would that assist the investigative team?
In terms of the officers' comments about we've just killed someone, it gives some indication as to what they thought was the level of restraint used, perhaps. I mean, you'd have to put that to the officers concerned, but it does give some indication as to the potential level of restraint used.
And so would that be a piece or an adminicle of evidence that could be used to consider in relation to the hypotheses that we're
Yes.
forming and developing? Thank you. Can I ask you about something else that you mentioned in your inquiry statement? So this relates to paragraphs 341 and 342 in your inquiry statement. And we'll see these on the screen. You talk here about starting service with Lothian and Borders Police. In terms of equality and diversity training, I can't recall any such training during my initial probationary period. It became a priority in the early 90s. It would have been the early to mid-90s. All officers and staff in Lothian and Borders Police had to attend a mandatory 5-day diversity training course. The programme of training lasted many years until all employees were trained. I think diversity and equality training was then transferred to be provided during probationer training, or if somebody needed retrained centrally at the Scottish Police College for the 8 forces and laterally Police Scotland. That'd be the 8 legacy forces that we've...
Yes.
I'm interested in the training that was provided in relation to equality and diversity. Can you describe the content of this 5-day diversity training course?
I think it might have been slightly less than 5 days. But
Right.
can I look at my scope record?
Please do, yes.
So the course I'm referring to, there's a couple of courses. It's got Equality and Diversity in 1993, but I think the course I'm referring to is the 2003. It was the 16th to the 18th of June, if this is correct. I have to say that there was some problems previously with scope when we transferred into the single force. But so this was a course that was, it was out with police premises, it was neutral premises, and it was probably the first course that I'd ever been on where the majority of inputs was from people with lived experience. So it wasn't police officers and it wasn't support and advocacy services relaying somebody's experience. So this was lived experience. And I remember it was really impactful at the time. Looking back on it, it was probably a training course of its time. You know, things have moved on. It was clear that some of the situations were heartbreaking in terms of experiences people had. They weren't all negative experiences of police. People had very good experiences, but it was the level of different experiences that people had that was probably quite shocking. But the training was about equality, about treating everybody equal. And as I said, that was probably training of its time, and things have moved on now.
Mm. When you say equal, do you mean the same? We've heard some evidence that people feel treating everyone the same is
yes, it was
fair, or...
Yeah, I suppose it was like colour blindness, treating everybody the same, but we know that actually people of different ethnicities have, their ethnicity is absolutely vital in terms of their personal experience from harassment, discrimination, microaggression or whatever. So the bit is you have to look at the individual as an individual and assess what their individual needs will be. So I think it was really, really impactful, but probably training of its time.
In relation to the message, perhaps, training
Yes.
of its time.
Yes.
But I'm interested in the idea that this course, you've said was it the first course where you learned about lived experience, and that was part of the training course. And I'm interested in, do you think that type of training course is more helpful in sharing messages with officers than just perhaps online training or
Oh, of course.
just having a lecture?
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that help officers comprehend the message perhaps better?
Absolutely. And, there has been other courses where, as I've said, support and advocacy services maybe explain the impact of police practice or a police interaction with somebody. I think and that is really helpful. Don't get me wrong, it is really, really helpful. But actually to hear it from somebody who has experienced it themselves, and that, ability to recognise and see how exactly that person has felt is really important.
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but did you say that was quite a powerful way
Yeah.
of sharing them?
I mean, I remember going back and you went individually, you didn't go with the people that you were working with, so it was a mixture of people from across the force that went. And every time somebody gone on a course came back, there was always chat about it, because it was a really powerful course.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, it's the bit about how you keep that in the forefront of people's minds. So there is equality and diversity thread through quite a lot of training. I think every training course there's equality and diversity, there's that golden thread that runs through it. But I've never been on a course like that since then, where it has that real impact.
So it can be a challenge keeping people up to date. And you said 2003 that course was?
Yes.
And was that a course that every member of the police service was required to attend?
Yes, I mean, I think it took years to, for every member of police, every police officer and members of police staff to go on that course. It took significant time.
Right. And then looking at paragraph 342 of your inquiry statement, you say, in terms of other aspects, I think it's become far better. The Equality and Diversity Steering Group have improved standards. Each area has to provide evidence of how they were thinking about equality and diversity in their area, in policy, practice and in strategy. My area was in depth because I had a whole range of other areas which perhaps would have more sensitivities around protective characteristics. On a quarterly basis, we had to evidence what we were doing and how strategies were being put into practice. In addition, around the 1990s in Lothian and Borders Police, diversity was a core competency which had to be evidenced during all police officers' appraisals, when applying for competency threshold payments and when applying for promotion. In relation to Police Scotland, there were other aspects that I found beneficial, particularly being a member of the Equality and Diversity Steering Group. There's a lot of information in there. Can I ask you some further questions? Primarily, the Equality and Diversity Steering Group, and you said they'd improve standards. Can you tell us who they are?
So I probably, since I've been retired for a number of years, I've probably got the names of the groups muddled up.
All right.
I did have a look online, and there was two groups. There was one chaired by the DCC, which was the strategy group, which I attended, but it was very high level. And then there was one underneath that, which I think it was called Equality and Diversity External Advisory Group, or it was something like that. Mm-hmm. And this probably had something to do with the Equality Act and the duty on public authorities in terms of their general duties, and then their specific duties to report on how we were achieving the equality outcomes, and our requirement to review policy and process with equality and human rights and equality impact assessments, etc. And then for my area, because protecting people at risk, which was my area of business, was one of the 5 key priorities for Police Scotland and annual action plans. It was how we were delivering that, taking cognizance of other strategies and legislation, which included the Equalities Act. Yeah. Can I carry on, or
Please
is that
do.
too?
No, this is very interesting. I'm hoping we'll hear more evidence about this in the future, but I'd like to get your evidence now.
So for me, we can sometimes become a bit siloed in our own area of business, and be really focused on our own areas and responsibilities. But this group was really good because it had representation from lots of different areas of Police Scotland. Mm-hmm. So how they were considering, it might have been human resources, how they were considering equality and diversity. It could have been lack of female officers in specialist roles. It could have been a workforce plan. So for that giving opportunity to people with protected characteristics. And so for me, it was a step out of my own silo for a wee while and actually seeing what was happening across the force in terms of equality and diversity, which I thought was really interesting.
So this was not specific or exclusive to Lothian and Borders Police?
No, this is in Police Scotland.
This was in Police Scotland?
This was in Police Scotland.
A national interest in this.
And the other really good point was the staff in National Safer Communities in Police Scotland were really proactive. And, you know, we had to put quite a lot of inputs in. If you can imagine, I had domestic abuse, so how that impacts on, you know, protective characteristics, or donor-based violence, how that impacts on protected characteristics. So it was really good because Safer Communities gave me quite a lot of assistance, and they were good advisors in terms of how everything could fit together with the other Scottish Government strategies and Police Scotland's priorities and equality. So it was a step out of my little silo.
And they would help you with this reporting element
Yes.
of it and
Yes.
evidencing things that you were doing.
Yes.
Thank you. And you've said that in Lothian and Borders, at least, diversity was a core competency that had to be evidenced during appraisals. Was that across Police Scotland, that it would be a core competency or not?
I don't know. There was a difficulty at the beginning of Police Scotland, which it was about those 8 legacy forces coming together in which competency framework and was going to be used. So there was a bit of time where in actual fact appraisals, they were working out how to have a standardised appraisal across Scotland. It was just at that time where you were pulling together 8 forces and everybody was doing things differently. So to be honest, I can't remember.
Right, thank you. I'd like to ask you about a comment you make in paragraph 344 of your inquiry statement. You say, when I first started the police, equality and diversity was never mentioned. There was very little training or awareness or thought given to the differing needs to individuals. But policing has become more about the well-being of communities as opposed to it being all about investigating and arresting criminals. More and more police time is spent dealing with well-being, and more often than not, those that need are those who are marginalised or who have situational vulnerabilities. So you said, when did you first start with the police?
1987.
Right. And at that time, equality and diversity was simply not mentioned.
Maybe that's a bit too strong. I can't say it was never mentioned, but yeah.
And very little training or awareness given to the differing needs. Does that also tie in with what you said a moment ago, that the training in 2003 was off its time in relation to the message that was being delivered? Policing has become more about the well-being of communities. I'm interested in how that there has been a change in policing, particularly in relation to equality and diversity.
So even the introduction of that in the Police Fire and Reform Act, so in terms of police responsibilities being to prevent licensed property and all the other bits and pieces, it was added in the new Act that our responsibilities were in partnership to improve the well-being of communities. So to a certain extent you could possibly say that that was now a statutory responsibility in terms of improving well-being of communities. And I suppose working more closely with partner agencies, and the bit about those who are marginalised of situational vulnerabilities. So that would, for me, a clear example of that is, I don't like the title of it, but that's another pet hate which we won't go into. So the Vulnerable Person Database. So it's when a police officer will attend a report or come across a person who they believe they've got concerns about their well-being or future well-being. There is an opportunity to create a concern form, and it's about child concern and child protection is about adult concern and adult protection. Hate crimes recorded on it. Domestic abuse is recorded on it, and youth offending is recorded on it. And what the hope for the VPD, which is national, is that you can start seeing some factors in terms of repeat victims or repeat escalation of concern. And it can be used, if there is no statutory power to do so, it can be used with consent to share information about the police officer's concerns to either third sector support and advocacy services or to statutory partners. And then if there continues, what you're wanting to, what was put in place for really is early intervention to stop an escalation of a problem and to make sure that those well-being, welfare needs of individuals are considered at an early stage.
In relation to the database that you've mentioned, the vulnerabilities database.
It's a vulnerable persons database.
Sorry, vulnerable persons.
VPD.
Thank you. You've talked about recording of hate crimes.
Yes.
Would that include crimes involving allegations of some sort of racist allegation?
Yes.
As well as others, no doubt.
Yes.
Would it also include complaints of racist behaviour?
Complaints against the police?
Yes.
Yes, because there would be a complainer for the hate crime itself. So the incident and the victim would be recorded on VPD. And, sorry, that's where, for the hate crime, for the statistics that are required by Scottish Government, that all comes from VPD as well. So there's, it's auditable in terms of its information because it's used for national statistics.
And when did that database get brought into existence?
So, probably 2014. Maybe the late end of 2013, 2014.
Now, obviously, the Equalities Act came into existence in 2010.
Yes.
Where was there a collation of, or a record of data in relation to hate crime or allegations involving racism? Where was it kept then?
I think each individual force would have kept statistics, but as a national picture of hate crime, that comes from VPD.
And that was created in 2014?
So the Vulnerable Persons Database, I think, was a Strathclyde database.
Right.
It was amended. It took some time in terms of what else was going to be collected and what, the information on it. But I'm sure that was all complete by sometime in 2014.
Thank you. Can we look at 345, please? I think the main thing was about the contact with the family. Not that I made any decisions around that, but that's the one part that I found was going to be significantly difficult, and that if we didn't get it right, then there would be more heartache, and I don't know if we got it right. I think the family said we didn't get it right, so that for me suggests we didn't get it right. Can you help the Chair understand what these difficulties were, and particularly how they could be improved?
So I think what I'm referring to is the communication with the family.
Mm-hmm. How could that have been improved?
So identification of, or maybe not identification, but the ability for flows to be deployed quicker. I think there's an opportunity to, or there's learning in terms of the briefing for death messages. And I think, especially for cases involving police officers and restraint, I think there's opportunities for PERC as well.
To improve their communication?
Yeah, I think we've all got improvements to make.
Thank you. And on reflection, have you got any further suggestions about improving communication with families that you'd like the chair to know about?
I think it's really difficult, and I know that there was the time delay was not as it should have been in terms of making contact with the family. It's the police responsibility to deliver a death message, and I completely get that. And I don't know any other agency who could maybe pass a death message. I just think that when there is a death in police custody involving police officers, it's always going to be really difficult to pass that death message because of the circumstances of police involvement. So there was probably, 3 layers of trauma for Mr. Bayo's family. So you've got the trauma of finding out that your loved one has died. You've got the trauma of learning that actually he died in the custody of the police. And then you've got the additional trauma of that members of the family themselves may have experienced racism or discrimination or negative life events because of their ethnicity. And if that's been caused by the police before, there's not going to be an awful lot of trust and confidence. Or if they've heard about problems with the police before from family or friends or the media or other events that have happened in the world. So in actual fact, there's 3 layers of potential, not potential, significant trauma in this case. And I think that it's going to be really difficult on any occasion for police officers to be able to pass a death message when the police have been in contact with families and be able to assist with reducing trauma or not reducing trauma, but getting that trust and confidence. So I don't know. I don't know whether if a person is in custody, now that there's NHS provision in custody, and that this is just an off-the-wall suggestion, to be honest, but if there was a death in custody and there's now NHS and custody facilities, whether a health professional could pass a death message, or circumstances if the individual died in hospital, it could be a health professional that passed the death message to take that difficult situation between family and police. Because I know it's not a PERC responsibility, and whilst I would hope that PERC would then parachute in, I think it's really difficult. I can't think of how we're going to get around it, but I think this case, just for a number of reasons that probably, we've got to think about the learning from it. But cases going forward, I think it is really difficult how police officers can pass a death message when the person's died in custody.
At the very least, do you think that officers who are given that task would perhaps benefit from more guidance about an effective way of delivering a death message?
Probably, yeah. I think further guidance might assist. I still think that it's going to be a difficult situation, whatever happens.
And more generally, looking back now, do you have any other comments on things that you're aware of that could perhaps have been improved or done better? Leaving aside the comments you've already given us about the family and communication.
I suppose and I'm probably thinking about that day and actually how that day went, the amount of meetings that took place within a short space of time, when in actual fact allowing Pat Campbell to have a better oversight of what was happening, and allow Pat Campbell and Park to, really, really dovetail in together in terms of Park's decisions and Park's requirements thereafter. But it just seemed that we just went from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. In actual fact, when are you going to allow the SIO to, ensure that the actions are getting the right priority and progressed? And when are you going to allow the time for the SIO to act in support of Park on their arrival? So, that's just a general observation.
So do you think that the numbers of meetings that had to be attended, we've talked about gold group meetings, we've talked
Yes.
about briefings, we've talked about a teleconference meeting at 9:30 in the morning, we've talked about a number of different meetings. Do you think that actually hindered the investigation?
I don't know if it hindered it, but it maybe could have assisted Pat Campbell and thereafter Pat Campbell in the Park to have a bit more time in terms of the investigation. But sorry, I keep saying investigation, but those fast-tracked actions at the beginning, as opposed to attending meetings. In terms of the Park briefing, that time could have been taken up between Pat Campbell and Keith Harrower, having 45 minutes together, sitting in a room and going through things face to face, as opposed to initial Park briefing with the ACC and a few others, and then doing that thereafter, or having that conversation thereafter. So it's about probably managing time better. And I know it's important, for the ACC as chief officer to be able to have that information, because at the end of the day, his responsibilities as a chief officer. But there's, the amount of meetings that were conducted that day, it just seemed you had half an hour before the next meeting took place. So,
Could you give me one moment, please?
Yes.
Thank you. There are one or two further matters I'd like to raise before I conclude my examination. It shouldn't take long, but I'm also conscious of the time for the stenographer. Would it be possible
Yes,
to
we'll
perhaps...
take a break, but before we do that, I wonder if you could clarify one matter for me, Ms. Boal.
yes.
This morning, just before and after the break, you had a discussion with Ms. Graham about the hypothesis that there could be racial motivation on the part of the officers. Do you remember that discussion?
Yes, I do.
Can I just clarify that what you were telling me was that you and your colleagues were conscious that that was a hypothesis that required to be kept live and investigated. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
You were not suggesting to me that you or any of your colleagues had already reached a view that that had been the case, namely that there had been racial motivation.
No, that
Yeah.
was part of what would come out then of the investigation stage. It was a possibility, but it hadn't been excluded. It was still ongoing.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll take a 15-minute break. Yes, Miss Graham.
We've heard that the post-mortem took place on the Monday, the 4th of May.
Yes.
And we've also heard evidence that there was a disclosure made to police officers, the officers who'd attended the incident at Hayfield Road, a disclosure regarding some preliminary information about the cause of death. Were you involved in any discussions about whether that was an appropriate thing to do? Disclose post-mortem information to the officers?
No, my whole involvement finished at the end of the Gold Group meeting on the Sunday. I had no further communication with the officers involved in the subsequent investigation.
Did you know that there was to be a disclosure to the police officers?
No.
Were you aware that that would be in advance of the family being given information about the cause of death?
To be honest, after the Sunday, I had no conversation with anybody in terms of what was happening or what happened thereafter.
Would it have caused you concern that officers who had failed to give initial accounts or basic facts or operational statements were being given information about the cause of death from the post-mortem on the Monday evening?
So they never gave statements until
The 4th of June,
4th of June. So,
over a month later.
so I wouldn't have agreed to provide information to officers following an initial post-mortem examination
Why not?
because they haven't given us a statement yet, you know, so it's the bit about why would you provide sensitive information in terms of the results of a post-mortem to a witness who hadn't provided a statement.
And what would your concerns have been if that information was to be provided?
That if the information was in some way negative to their viewpoint, it might change the way that they would provide their statement. It's just not appropriate.
We've heard some evidence that it may have been because the officers didn't wish to provide statements until they had information about cause of death. There may have been a view that if they were given the information, they may then decide to provide statements. Would that have altered your view?
I don't think it would have.
Thank you. And in terms of if that information was provided to officers prior to the family being given that information about the post-mortem, would you have concerns about that?
Absolutely.
And what would those be?
Because the family takes precedence against anything.
All right. And can I ask you about, just returning for a moment to in relation to status?
Mm-hmm.
I asked you earlier about Austin Barrett and the
Yes.
comment that I read out, which was from Craig Walker. We've just killed someone. I'm pretty sure that's exactly what they said. That's his recollection
Mm-hmm.
of the events. And PC Payton was in the room at the time. And you commented on that earlier and the importance of that. You've also said yesterday, did it amount to reasonable ground, looking at evidence, did it amount to reasonable grounds to suspect a crime had been committed, and there was a person responsible, and if you had reasonable grounds, that of itself could change the status
Yes.
of a person from witness to suspect. Thinking about the comment that is contained within this statement from Austin Barrett, we've just killed someone, would that have been enough to change the status of an officer from witness to suspect?
That on itself, possibly not. I think if it was supported by other evidence to show the restraint, and if the restraint looked like it was excessive, you know, I think it's a bit about was the response by the officers appropriate to the threat that they faced, and the type of restraint and the length of restraint, could that be seen as reasonable? I suppose the fact is it could be a life and death situation, and you use force as a firearms officer can. That, given the circumstances, it may be still legitimate to use that force. So it could be that the danger and the restraint was absolutely necessary. So we've just killed that person. I think it's absolutely significant in terms of that continued investigative strategy as to what exactly happened and what evidence you've got of restraint, force and threat posed to officers.
Would you have wanted more information about the circumstances before forming a concluded view about that?
I think some other supporting evidence that the restraint was excessive.
Thank you. I had a comment that I put to Gary McEwen that had been made by John McSpadden.
Mm-hmm.
He, we've heard, is involved with PERC,
Yes.
or he was at the time. And this was a suggestion made by him in a witness statement that the chair has available to him.
Okay.
Can I ask, I'll read it out and then I'll ask you to comment.
Okay.
Police Scotland, it relates to statements, obtaining statements. Police Scotland could have instructed or ordered 9 officers to provide a statement on the grounds that it is within their standards of professional behaviour, i.e. constables give and carry out only lawful orders and instructions. Failure to obey a lawful order may constitute misconduct under the Police Scotland Conduct Regulations 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have any comments about that statement that Mr McSpadden has made? Do you agree with that?
I think Police Scotland could have requested officers to provide statements. I think their legal advice and is important, that they're afforded legal protection or legal advice like any other person. And if we had instructed them to do so, the quality of statement, I would think, would be quite limited.
Thank you.
So I think that was the point I was making earlier on.
Mm.
We can ask, but we cannot sit down and force a pen into somebody's hand and make them write down something.
Thank you. Then finally, you talked about safer communities earlier on this afternoon. Is that a particular team in Police Scotland?
Yes.
Thank
It's
you.
based at the Scottish Crime Campus, National Safer Communities, or it was anyway. I don't know, in the last number of years it might have changed. It might have a different name, but that's where they're based. And there was an equality and diversity section within the broader National Safer Communities.
Thank you. Give me one moment, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes my questions for this witness.
Thank you. Are there any Rule 9 applications? Well, thank you very much, Ms. Boal, for coming
Thank you.
to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful to you for taking the time, and you covered a wide range of subjects, so that's very helpful. The inquiry is about to adjourn, and then you'll be free to go.
Thank you very much.
We're adjourned now until the 12th of September.